Good morning. Okay.
Right. Okay. Good evening, everybody. It's great to see such a fantastic turnout tonight. It nearly didn't happen. Pretty much every challenge that's been thrown in front of us came to pass. I managed to give Raymond the wrong day, and he was very accommodating by switching and managing to make tonight, which was great. The internet connection in our house managed to crash completely this afternoon, so I had to go to I've had to go to a friend's house, but we just little challenges along the way that I'm sure that we're all familiar with where technology is concerned. It's great to be with Raymond tonight. We've collaborated on some podcasts already, and we've put together a program that I know some of you have already started to work with, a stable confidence program. We've got a particular subject that we want to talk about tonight, but many of you have already heard of Raymond on the podcast, or you've got his book, Golf Beneath the Surface, which is an essential read if you haven't already got it. But Raymond, maybe if you want to just say a few words about who you are and what you do and your background before we get started.
Yeah, well, firstly, good evening to everybody where you are. Karl tells me there must not be anything on TV tonight if everyone is joining us, so that's great. Um, by training and trade, I am a performance psychology professional. My areas of quote unquote expertise are performance psychology, performance neuroscience, and sleep science. And probably the reason I'm here is because I work with a lot of professional golfers, mostly here in America and somewhat worldwide. So hopefully we can touch on an important confidence related topic tonight, then maybe answer some questions and give people some value on the way out.
And what we'd put as the heading for the session tonight was a problem that I see over and over again now, probably more so than ever, where especially with young players, where the sense of self and the sense of value as a human being is being so closely aligned to their scorecard and what they do on a golf course. And I see, perhaps as I say, more than I've ever done, a real inherent vulnerability with people out there that they're so attached to the score and in many ways seem really fragile in terms of performance, almost one shot away from insanity all of the time. And I think for many of us who've kind of tuned in tonight, it'll be a familiar story that if you've been playing golf for a while, you go through that wonderful period where you take up the game, you start to develop some skills, you start to get some successes. And as you get some successes, you maybe get a little bit of attention. You know, people start to remark about how well you're doing, at the game. You may get some successes, you maybe win some things. And I think for many people, there is a slow but sure crossover from the game itself to then becoming what the game says about me or what the game is going to give me in the future. And I think very often when that happens and there's a kind of mesh between a person's value as a human being and what they do on a golf course, they become so closely intertwined that it puts so much pressure on them as a golfer. I remember many years ago reading a wonderful book by a guy called Chuck Hogan, who those of you who've trained with me before know he was a big influence on me in the early days. And Chuck Hogan wrote a number of books in the 80s and early 90s. He worked with a lot of tour players. And one of the books that he wrote was a book called Tiger's Bond of Power, and it was all about Tiger Woods and his upbringing. And Chuck Hogan always talked about the fact that Tiger Woods played from what he called a safe place, whereby there was a distinct separation between Tiger Woods, the golfer, and Tiger Woods, the person. So if Tiger Woods, the golfer, had a bad day on the golf course, it didn't so much affect him as a person, as a human being. And it's something I'm really keen to explore with Raymond. How can we get a little bit better, either as an individual player, if we are a player, or as a coach? How can we separate that sense of identity from on a golf course of what we actually do from what we actually are? So, Raymond, any initial thoughts on the subject itself and what you see with the players that you work with?
Yeah, let me start with perhaps some psychological and neurological underpinnings of what you're talking about. The phrase I would use with that is a coupling of self and craft. You might call this a pairing of identity to craft. There are a couple of different ways to say it, but it essentially means I paired my identity and then therefore how I feel about myself to the outcomes of my performance. It's really very common for us as human beings. There's some anthropological and historical precedents for this, where back when we were all traveling in tribes, if we weren't really concerned with how valuable we felt to ourselves and the others around us, it might lead us to being excommunicated from the tribe, which was essentially a death sentence. So, historically, we as humans have learned to be very attuned to how valuable we feel. So, there is certainly a historical precedent to this. From a psychological standpoint, more in our modern world, what you're seeing is a subset of a fixed mindset. And it's important to understand like how our identity gets paired in the first place. And if you look at the research around mindset, essentially the most prominent, not the only, but the most prominent cause is the feedback we get early on any learning curve and what form that feedback comes in. So, Karl, what you alluded to is, I take up golf, for example, particularly when we're young. By definition, because we are young, we're early on a learning curve. So that's why early influences of messaging, particularly from adults, is really powerful for us. We are not born with beliefs. They are learned. So we're essentially a psychological blank slate when we're born. And what fills in that slate is largely from the feedback and the messages we get from the people around us and the world around us. And if you start something particularly young and you start to see success, it is very, very likely that people start telling you, quote unquote, how good you are, how good you could be. And on the surface, this seems like really positive self-esteem building feedback. And that is, both of those are true. The downside is behind the scenes, what's happening is it's starting to weave our identity into these what we would call noun-based identifiers, like you are good, you are special, you are talented, you have potential, whatever, these kind of vague, very you're either born with it or not type of fixed mindset terms, fixed being a trait that you either have or you don't. Right. You are essentially, we're communicating in either explicitly or not so explicitly. Your importance and being attention worthy for you, it comes from you doing this thing. So what starts to happen is who we are starts to blend with what we do. And the tighter these two become, as you had alluded to with Tiger Woods here, is now when you're performing, it's no longer an emotionally and a psychologically safe place because your identity is at stake when you're going to compete. And we as humans love to pretend that we're super, super tough and we're fighters when it comes to fight, flight, or freeze. But if I put you in a position where your identity is at stake, something we hold psychologically and emotionally very dearly, you're going to protect that first before you go pursue what performance that you have cooked up or the outcomes that you really want. Right. So the downside with coupling yourself and craft is that once you get past the point in the learning curve where just being good at something is lead to success, and you need more time, more effort, and you have to experience more mistakes and failures and setbacks, more loss in order to gain toward the things that are you want but are not guaranteed. Now what you're doing starts to become very threatening to you personally, and then again, we will protect what we personally identify with far more than we will pursue the things that we really want if both of those things are offered at the same time. So you're not in an emotionally safe relationship with your craft if your identity is at stake. It's very transactional, it's very conditional. And if you do that over and over again, what happens? It becomes the recipe for anxiety. And if that plays out long enough, it's the recipe for burnout. And needless to say, if you're talking about the stability of confidence, if you have to go perform to know who you are and how valuable you are, their confidence is going to be unstable because it's a very shaky ground to build it upon.
And as a beginning to identify that is one thing, Raymond, but then getting out of that situation or working your way out of that situation becomes a real challenge. And I've, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm just seeing it more and more, especially with younger players these days, that there is just this knife edge that they're on all the time of good performance, poor performance. And tragically, I've seen a number of young players who had a wonderful relationship with the game in the early days, but that relationship starts to sour more and more as their identity is on the line. One of the things that I've found with this, to begin to come out of this a little bit or to see through it, is an understanding of some key questions. You know, it's something that Gary Nichol and myself wrote about in the Lost Art books, is to get very clear, asking yourself that question: why do I play golf? Why is it that I actually do this thing called golf? And what sounds a really, really simple question, why do I play golf, to me requires a little bit of attention and some pondering and some consideration, because very often when you ask the question, why do I play golf, you'll just pop up with the initial answers that you'll come up with will be almost an advert for what you've heard from somebody else. But I think to really get some depth and understanding about why you actually play the game of golf, I think can begin to start to, then you're playing the game more for genuine reasons that are really valuable to you, as opposed to playing for other people. What would your thoughts on that be, Raymond, as to begin to come out of this situation, or to, I don't suppose anybody can totally come out of it, but what would be some ways to uncouple yourself from the craft?
Yeah. So you're on a really nice trajectory with that, in that you are asking somebody, well, why do you play golf? Not, and the key with that question is you. Why do you play golf? Not why someone told you should play golf, or the reasons you've adopted. And what that question initially will oftentimes expose is, what are the messages that I have encoded mindlessly, right? Or it will reveal that someone has actually put in some introspection and some self-reflection into why they play the game, right? So you're looking for, what are the intrinsic and self-directed reasons that you play golf, the ones that are credible to you, right? Like, as you said, when we're young and we're trying to figure out how to navigate the world and what it means to be a quote unquote good golfer, we often adopt what people say, and pardon my language on here, but what you hear pro golfers say on TV in front of a camera is so much bullshit. They are all acting way more confident than they really are, talking about how things are much more easier. It is not an accurate reflection of what most of them are experiencing internally, right? And so if I just adopt that blindly, it's like kind of someone telling you Santa Claus exists without you questioning the idea, simply because it was presented to you, right? And then herein lies the challenge for us, is that the beliefs that we adopt early, one of them being my identity is paired to this thing that I'm doing, that our tendency as human beings is to continue to confirm that which we already believe, rather than to challenge and perhaps move to something more factual and accurate, and probably better for us over time, right? And the way that we have to move off of those, if the research is giving us any indication to how, is we have to challenge the factual nature and the utility, meaning how valuable this core belief is for you, right? And doing so with direct evidence. So any core belief that we've had, for example, Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, whatever it might be, at one time in our life, we believed was absolutely true. And the way we got off it, where we go, no, that's just a thing about the holidays that is, part of the spirit of it, but it's not actually a thing. There's a separation between those two, you might say, comes from exploring what are the direct evidence to tell me the contrary in a way that I cannot deny. Right. So just trying to change one belief by stuffing in another belief is very challenging for us as human beings, because our brain has accumulated a bunch of evidence to suggest the first one is real in a biased and confirmed way. Right. And then the other point that you're getting to with that question is, you have to start to tap into what are the intrinsic, not extrinsic reasons that you might engage with something. Not that those extrinsic reasons are bad, or that they aren't indeed important. But if they are the only means by which you are measuring your identity, your self-worth, your confidence, your motivation, that transactional relationship cannot be withheld. In fact, the longer you do something and the better you get at it, the more of a tolerance you build to those things to do the things that they used to do for you lower on the learning curve and when we were younger, right? So things like money, everybody in this room has made enough money in their life at one point in their life said, that will make me happy, motivated, feel satisfied, whatever. And yet we're ongoing earners in our lives, right? And the very few people that do get to that point are at that point because they found like, well, what is intrinsically motivating to me? What is true to me from an internal state first, rather than a, you have to go shoot this score, earn this dollar amount, be this famous, etc. Right? So again, all these things are not necessarily bad, but if they're the primary means by which you are judging yourself and your life and your participation in something, they are fragile means at best, even for the very best players in the world. If anything, they're more fragile for them because the window to deem success and failure gets smaller, not bigger. So if I'm summarizing here, it's identifying the core belief behind it, which might be a coupling of self and craft, then challenging that idea with direct evidence, not just logic and rationality. And then also tapping into what are the intrinsic reasons for which I do this, that if those extrinsic things were not available to me, would make this experience worthwhile for me to engage with and allow me to be myself and be my authentic self without something else telling me to do so. And that is a real challenge if you have gone a long time with your identity paired to something. And the danger with that identity being paired to that is if you cannot start to create that separation, you're at risk for identity foreclosure, which is, well, this is what I identify. I've put all my eggs in this basket. What happens if I don't have that basket?
And just to move on with this idea of clarity of the intrinsic reasons why you play golf. I think that's why it's worth pondering that question deeply. Why do I play? But then I think once you've got some indication of what's truly important for you, I think then it's really vital that it goes from conceptual information to actual embodied experience. And for me, then we kind of look at some of the rituals that we do before we play golf. We're all keenly aware that it would be a good idea to warm up physically before you go out to play, hit some shots, tune into what you've got that day in terms of ball flights, etc., get a feeling for pace on the greens. But I found over and over again that the people who seem to get the most out of the game, one thing that definitely I think is a link to getting away from this and getting through it is to journal, is to physically write things down. And I know that's a challenge in the modern world, that everybody tends to want to put things in computers and phones. But I think journaling, to me, if you look at this as the starting point, hopefully, of a nice season and some good weather and some great experiences, if there was one thing that I would recommend everybody do, it would be to get yourself a specific journal for this year. Get something that's significant for you. Don't get any old notebook. Get yourself a moleskin journal, something that feels really important to write in, almost a sacred ritual, really. And then for me, the day that you play golf, it's only a 5-minute exercise or so, but to just contemplate the experience that you're about to have. And perhaps we'll touch on gratitude and appreciation. Those who trained with me before know how much I value that as a core belief. But then to look at the experience that you're about to have and just ask yourself a couple of key questions. To me, one of the key questions is, what am I actually committed to today? If you feel that the social element of the game of golf is really important to you, and that's something that gives you a real value for that 4 or 5 hours on the golf course, to actually write that down before you play and commit to it. Once you've actually written it down, to me, there's an element then you're kind of pre-programming some behavior in, but you're actually making yourself accountable. Am I actually going to act out on the things that are important to me? My meditation teacher, Vin Harris, who I think is on the call tonight, he came out with a great line when we were doing a mindfulness book together, and he said it's really important to understand why you play golf. But it's even more important to think about why you play golf when you play golf, because it's easy to get out there and become detached from that. And I think it's also, and I'll get Raymond's take on this, I think it's also really important to understand that what we're saying here isn't just all fluffy, soft tree hugging stuff. It's actually creating potentially the best performance state for you. Because if you're out there on the golf course and you are in an appreciative state and you are connected to your values, I think then that is going to give you the gateway to release your true capabilities. But for me, the strongest message would be it needs to go from a conceptual understanding of this stuff to an embodied experience through practical application. And I think the journal is one of the most practical ways that you can do that. Raymond, your thoughts on that?
Well, if I could make a case for the journaling, there's a variety of research that shows that when we write things down in our own handwriting in our own native language, our brain recognizes it in a way that starts to bridge the gap between thoughts and action. So here you're talking about, can I do something that is helping bridge the gap between what I intend to do and me actually doing it? So whether that comes in the form of handwriting beforehand or the night before, whatever that might be. But when we are far more intentional, like the primary architect of our experience, and we have explored what we want to do and for the reasons that we want to do it, that goes a long way rather than just going into something hoping. A phrase I use with my clients is hope is not a very viable strategy. It's too passive, right? And if playing golf is an important experience to you and how that plays out and perhaps how well you perform, there's some intentionality that is important behind that. And intention is one of the three pillars behind mindfulness, which is I'm going to pay attention to what I'm doing and how I'm doing it on purpose so that I can course correct in a way that is more in line with what I kind of experience I want to have more often. It doesn't mean that you enjoy everything about the experience, but it means that you are at least in charge of how you're paying attention to things and how you are responding to them and being intentional with what that would look like. And for the reasons that you would want to do that beforehand goes an awful long way. And there was another part to your response there, Karl, that I've since lost. So give me the synopsis of the second part of what you were talking about there.
It was the second. It was the writing down and being accountable to what you've written down. So when you're out on the golf course, to think about why you play golf. Actually, when you play golf, when you're out there.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. So then I will pull on that by going, you're kind of, again, tapping into, I would use the word values. Like, what do you value most in your experience? And what that does is it starts to shift our focus and therefore our motivations more intrinsically, which again, doesn't mean you're not trying to shoot the best score that you can or beat the people around you or win a tournament. But the order of operations goes from internal to external. So almost think about it like the ingredients of the cake are coming internally, the frosting on the cake is an external thing. This is really important for us because the research around high performers is really clear. Those that are more intrinsically motivated have longer, more satisfying, and more successful careers, regardless of how you define success, even if that's an outcome measure of success. What happens is, as we are more intrinsically motivated, doing things for the reasons that are important to us of our own design, the experience itself becomes more motivating and the outcomes become the byproduct, and which is the opposite of what happens when our identity is paired to our performance. The outcomes are the thing telling us who we are, and the means to get to the outcomes, the vessel itself, is almost like a hollow shut, like a shell. It's like whatever I got to do to get to the outcomes, which again makes the thing itself less enjoyable and less fulfilling. So needless to say, one of these is a long-term performance model and one is very shaky, because if the thing you are doing is not motivating and engaging for you in and of itself, once you feel like outcomes that you need or want are not available to you, it becomes very easy to check out, to give out on that thing. And ultimately what happens is we become less competitive, less resilient, less grounded in our experience when we are not the primary architect, where it's coming from our intrinsic space first into an extrinsic space second. So journaling is a great way to start to shift that external to internal focus and motivation and kind of, you might say, architecture source first. Because again, you are asking the questions and what you want to do for the reasons that are important to you. So you might call them values, you might call them the experiences within what would make the experience more fulfilling. And by the way, what would make you higher performing and what would that look like, are far better than, well, I just hope I go play today so that I can feel okay.
And then I think to sort of to journal before you start, to ask that question, what am I committed to today? And you write down what's important for you. I think then the act of reflection afterwards, once you've finished playing at some point and the day's settled in your mind, to just reflect on how close did you actually get to that commitment that you made. Because I think, again, my experience has been with players when you can make a commitment and you can reflect on that commitment afterwards, and you know you've honored that commitment, I think there is a real value to that, and there's a pleasure attached to it, regardless of the outcome of the day. We're not trying to pretend for 1 minute here that score doesn't matter. A lot of this is really relevant to performance, but I think to actually reflect and write down some of the thoughts and maybe some of the good experiences, how you dealt with some of the less than perfect experiences, again, becomes really, really valuable. One other area I wanted to touch on with Raymond that I just keep finding is worth exploring even more and more is that we spend so much time and energy on trying to improve technique and ball striking and all the rest of it, which is obviously very valuable. We're not saying for 1 minute that you don't need to develop skills. You clearly do, and that's a whole other subject. But I think perhaps the most underutilized or undervalued or misunderstood part of the game of golf is the 90% of the time that we're actually out on the golf course and we're not actually playing. Fred Shoemaker said to me 30 years ago, what about if the time in between shots was the most valuable time? What if that was the key element to the game? And I think the more you can begin to look at that area of the game, the 90%, again, I think it's just a complete win because you have by and large far more agency over what happens in that particular time. And I think if we get to the point where we reflect on some of the best experiences that we've had playing golf, yes, it's wonderful to play well and it's nice to hit good shots, but also there's just an inherent joy that can be had from being out there in good company, or getting the best out of it with your caddy or whatever it is, to look to other areas than the obvious as a sort of underpinning that can facilitate performance. What are your thoughts on that, Raymond? What are maybe some of the things that you discuss with your clients about the 90%, the huge amount of time that we're not actually playing the game?
Yeah, the word I would use to describe that is diversification of experience. Um, and look, most of the clients I work with, if you told them you're going to have a terrible 90% of your experience, but the outcomes of that 10% are going to be what you want, they would take that. But that's not actually the formula that works out to usually set up those outcomes. So again, we're not pretending outcomes don't matter or the physical skill doesn't matter. But if all of my experience is hanging upon a small one thing, again, that's no different than identity foreclosure. It's just outcome foreclosure, where this one thing has to go a certain way, or it's this all or nothing approach with my performance. And oftentimes, what that happens is it causes us to bring a lot of anxiety to those inflection points that we have created because, needless to say, the whole thing is riding on it. So the likelihood of us performing freely and performing well goes way down, which then again continues to deteriorate the experience. And it starts to become a cycle where the worse we do, the worse things get, the worse things get, the worse we do. And it kind of goes around and around, right? So although you might acknowledge that you would love to shoot your lowest score, whatever experience that might come from, you're actually teeing yourself up to be able to execute better if you can tap into, well, what are some of the things about the experience itself that make this satisfying, fulfilling, worthwhile, a curious experience, something that where, yes, the outcomes do matter, but they're not the end all be all. And again, when things become an end all be all for us, our brain is designed to get protective, not explorative, right? And so if I want to explore how well I can play, I've got to give my brain some freedom to be able to do that. And so what that might look like is just tapping into, well, what about the experience other than just the outcomes is something that is interesting to you, worth exploring, enjoyable, satisfying, anything that's just worth paying attention to, that kind of brings you into your experience for the sake of being in the experience and reaping some of its rewards more than just I need the outcomes, is you're teeing yourself up from a psychological and neurological perspective to be in a place to play and execute better and recover faster from things when they don't go well, because again, you're much less likely to make the conclusion, well, this isn't worth it, the whole thing is, up in a hell in a handbasket, I'm only on hole number 6. Right. So we do become more resilient when there are more things about the experience that give us reason to be engaged with it. Right. If you think about what resiliency is by definition, it's us giving ourselves a reason to stick with things when they get really hard or not going the way that we want to see if we can improve things, and perhaps they'll go the way that we want to. But if we don't have really good, credible reason to do that, we typically don't. And hence why you see people who kind of see outcomes as all or nothing, or have coupled themselves to their craft where their identity is at stake. They're not very resilient because the thing they needed to keep things engaged with them, once it becomes, and it's a subjective experience, but once it starts to become something that they don't think is available to them, the next course of action for our brain and nervous system is to get out of that experience. And it's either literally, I'm out of here, I'm going to leave, or we call it quit and stay, which is like, yes, I'm finishing the round, but I've quit trying to be good company, to play well, to do the things that I want to. And it's kind of, I either throw my hands up or I'm just miserable throughout the entire thing. So if we can diversify the experience a little bit, like you would your financial portfolio, oftentimes you are not beholden to one thing, and then you are more able to handle the ups and downs because you have other counterbalancing areas to go with it.
The program that we put together, I mean, the stable confidence program, and as I say, I know a number of people have already started to work with it and use it. I think if we were to kind of summarize what we talk about in that program, it's kind of counterintuitive in many ways, that the development of the skill of acceptance is such an important thing. Talk about, if you could, Raymond, what you sort of believe and understand, because I think many people, when they talk about or hear the word acceptance, there's an initial resistance to that, because they believe erroneously that acceptance is in some way not giving your best, or giving up, or not trying your best, or whatever. It's a subtle rope to walk in many ways, but I've seen it time and time again, that when somebody is willing to fully embrace and accept the complete diversity of potential outcomes that you can have on the golf course, they're actually then much more free to express their true capabilities. Maybe some thoughts that you could share on that, because I think it ties directly in with the coupling of self to craft.
Sure. So if you think about our human brain, if you were to boil it down to the two things that it really does, like any behavior that we have, you boil it down to its barest bones, we are either pursuing or we are avoiding. That's it.
Yeah.
Right. So again, our brain evolved long, long ago when that was basically, those were the two options available to us. Okay. So if we think about thriving as pursuing the things that are important to us in the ways that are important to us for the reasons that are important to us, and avoiding as I'm just trying to survive something, to get through it, to get it over with, to not screw it up. Intuitively, any golfer knows that those are two different experiences and two different levels of performance, right? So if we're talking about acceptance, again, the layman's understanding is I'm settling for less, or I'm resigning myself to whatever my current fate might be, which is one definition of it. The psychological definition of it is I'm dealing with things as they are, and what they have been, and what they might be on reality's terms, not mine. Okay. So what that means is anytime I step into a golf shot, regardless of how good I am, there is always a chance this ball doesn't go where I want to. The competitive risk involved with playing competitive golf is you might lose, and you might try your best and that not be enough, right? Just like if you're in a romantic relationship, there's always the chance that somebody might break your heart, right? So you can think of acceptance like our tolerance for risk. Where it plays out in our performances, if I give my brain a pursuit-based task, go play golf today freely, see how well you can play and how low you can shoot, and at the same time, protect your identity by not making mistakes and not making failure, and please don't go make mistakes, don't hit bad golf shots. My brain has two tasks. And we as human beings, despite the fact that we think we are, we're not very efficient multitaskers, particularly with things that require real precision and skill, right? There's a reason we're not allowed to text and drive, at least here in America. I don't know what the rules are in the UK, but you're not allowed to do it because you get both abilities become compromised when you're trying to do them at the same time because your focus is just jumping back and forth. How that plays out in a golf swing is that if I give you two tasks, go pursue hitting this shot here, and dear God, don't hit it here. Well, my brain by default is designed that when that risk comes to fruition, to prioritize avoidance over pursuit. So the top of my backswing and the 0.2 of a second it takes to get to impact, if I'm telling myself, hey, go hit it here, and dear God, don't hit it there, that is about 5 times as much time it takes for my subconscious brain to prioritize avoidance over pursuit, which is why when I'm telling myself, dear God, don't hit it left, even though I've picked out a very clear target, the likelihood of it going 10 miles right is very, very, very high. Because essentially I'm asking my brain to pursue and avoid when it will prioritize avoidance at the top. What acceptance does for us when I go, you know what, I am going to hit it there and I wouldn't like it and I wouldn't prefer it and I wouldn't be satisfied with, but I am willing to experience the outcomes that I do not want or the experiences I don't want. Essentially, I'm telling my brain, you do not need to multitask with avoidance. So you potentially losing today, embarrassing yourself, or hitting a poor shot into a place you don't want, those are all unwanted and inconvenient outcomes, but they are not something that you need to save me from. And then because I am willing to accept those, my brain then goes, well, then what do you want to do? And I say, I want to hit it at this shot and I want to do that. And because I'm not trying to save myself from the outcomes I don't want, my brain is far more likely to move in the direction of the thing that I am asking it to do. So, on a neurological level, what acceptance does for us is it limits multitasking, particularly with avoidance, so that my brain now is devoted to pursuing. What it creates for us psychologically is no more anxiety, or at least minimal anxiety, because I haven't created a future I'm telling myself is threatening enough to try to save myself from. So, by definition, anxiety is worry about the future. Only the future, we don't actually know how it's going to play out. So, any future that is scaring me is one that I'm creating for myself, right? So, by accepting all possible outcomes in the future or accepting the past as it was without treating it as a precursor to the future and accepting whatever my internal state might be or whatever shot I might actually be facing, I'm more resilient because I'm dealing with things as they are without me adding things to them. And I'm also giving my brain a far more clear path to be able to be task oriented because it only has one pursuit based task. And then it also won't surprise you that neurologically, this feels a whole lot better than trying to play through avoidance during an entire day because it's really taxing to play that way. So, those would be the neurological and psychological underpinnings of acceptance. So, essentially, when we're willing to experience the stuff that we don't want, we have cleared a bunch of psychological and neurological space to go pursue the things that we do. And then how that plays out down kind of the domino effect for our body is we are now nervous instead of anxious. Nervous is our nervous system literally activating for action, but it's neutral. So it could be excitement. It also could be anxiety. And so what tips it to anxiety or one way or the other is what I'm multitasking with. So I've gone psychological, neurological, physiological in a way that is, again, teeing me up closer and increasing the likelihood that I have a fulfilling experience and perform better because I'm not asking my golf skills to do something they can't, which is avoid risk at all costs.
And essentially, Raymond, with that neurological component to it, then from that you're then able to access the motor skills that you do have, the communication from mind to body to access the current skills that you have is now available to you.
Yeah, you're not gating your access to your skills, right? So if you think about your skills, if I have one hand, for those who can't see, it's really, really high. Maybe that's my skill, my current skill level. But the more multitasking I do with avoidance, like it's gating. It's you can only play as well as you can play freely. right? And so if I don't have a high enough level of acceptance for the things I don't want, wherever that level of acceptance is where is the amount of access I have to my current skill level. And this is the challenge for all of us, particularly those who are really good golfers, is it's not really a question, like any player that I work with on the LPGA and PGA Tour, it's not a question of are they good enough to play at that level. The question is, are you going to play freely often enough to find out, right? And so that's often what weeds players out at that level, because everybody is capable enough of playing well. Now, I'll just give an example. Like last week, one of the players I worked with was in a group with Peter Malnati, and it was the most disgusting round of golf I've seen from a professional in a long time. I think he shot an 82 or 83 or something. It was really rough around that course. Different level of freedom this week, and he wins on tour, right? So what did his physical ability change in 5 days? Pretty unlikely. Different level of freedom will grant access to that in a much faster way, but you have to do it in a way that is consistent enough if you want to be a really high performer more often. And that often comes down to the level of acceptance you're bringing to the things that you don't want.
And I think so much resistance on the golf course is due to, you talked about either pursuit or avoidance. I think the very fact that we're out there with a scorecard and it's so easy to fall into the trap of trying to avoid bogeys, of trying to avoid mistakes. Those mind factor coaches who are on the call with us tonight, we've talked a lot about going out on the golf course and playing the accumulation game, where you instead of falling into the trap of trying to avoid making mistakes, can you actually set up a game within the game where you're aiming to accumulate as many good shots as you can? It doesn't have to specifically be shots, but I think when you can change the frame of reference and actually create a game within the game where you're in pursuit of something, then you can go out there with a different mindset, that you're not trying to avoid something, you're directly in pursuit of something. And every shot then, when you're trying to avoid a poor score, every shot that you hit becomes a potential opportunity to lose something. If you go out there with a mindset of trying to accumulate something, that you start with nothing and every shot is then an opportunity to gain something. So I think again, this is, we can't cover it all on tonight's call, but I think it's about changing the reference of what the game actually is, and maybe changing the frame of what the game actually is, to create a game within a game where it's more about accumulation as opposed to avoidance.
Yeah, and I would even add to that really what you're talking about, playing out of avoidance, everything in your round of golf is very threatening. Like the possibility of a bad shot, but even positive things like, well, I made a couple of birdies. Well, now what's that threat is what happens if I make a couple of bogeys to negate these two, right? So there's nothing in your performance that doesn't become threatening if your primary motivation underneath is don't screw up. Because as soon as you do something well, you have something to screw up. And if you don't do something well, you have already screwed up. And now there's another opportunity to screw up, right? Conversely, when you play with a high level of acceptance, you are more open to the opportunities of what you can pursue in front of you. And if you're 3 under through 5, it's an opportunity to try to get it as low as you can rather than try to protect it all the way into the clubhouse, which would be a threat to your score. And it plays out, and you can see it in people. The more you kind of see the underpinnings and the mechanisms behind it, and you understand what's happening, you can see it play out in people pretty frequently. But to your point, almost if you're asking why do you play golf, and they're all avoidance-based reasons, that might be a good thing to kind of reassess your relationship with the game and tap into what are the reasons that you want to play and the things that you want to pursue, and know that some of the things you don't want are part of the experience, but they don't have to drive the experience. It's a misconception that the dudes that win golf tournaments every week or the girls that win golf tournaments every week are playing great shots all the time. If you watch every shot by shot, even a 8 under or 7 under score includes a couple. Usually there's a bogey in there somewhere if you're playing that aggressively, and or you got away with some stuff, but it's not all flawless performance. That's for sure.
But I think, like you've said there, I mean, that simple idea of what can I pursue as opposed to what can I avoid sets the mind in motion to seek that out then, and it's a different route to take. Just I'm conscious of time. Just go into some detail, Raymond, about you've shared with me a great metaphor for being out there on the golf course about being on time, and the idea that if you had two wristwatches on, one wristwatch on the left wrist would tell you the actual objective time. The wristwatch on the right hand would actually tell you where your mind was in time. So trying to get the two watches to synchronize together. Now, I know everybody listening will have heard that, you know, you need to be in the present and stay in the moment and all that kind of stuff. What are some of the thoughts that you have relative to what we've talked about tonight that can assist you to be on time more often during your actual experience on the course?
Yeah. Well, if you think about, perhaps again, if we boil things down to either avoiding or pursuing, avoiding is a future-based time frame, right? I'm trying to avoid something happening in the future that I don't want. That's going to draw my focus toward the future. So if I have one watch telling me the actual chronological time of the Earth in the physical moment I'm in, if I was in an anxious state, that means that the watch telling me where my psychological time is down the road and in the future, right? Now, the challenge here is anytime we're off time, meaning dwelling on the past or projecting the future, by definition, we're multitasking between the time frame we're actually in and a time frame that we're not. There is a time to think about the past where that is the task and we can learn from it and be valuable. We've talked about reflection a little bit. There's also a time to forecast the future and perhaps project a little bit, problem solve before we get there. Our journaling exercise that you had mentioned before around can be one of those, right? You're almost planning out the future experience. But anything that we are creating or actually pursuing requires action and focus now. And so, from a psychological perspective, what being present isn't just some Zen state where we're not thinking. What it means is we're immersed in the task at hand. And by way, that is the primary variable for flow state. Immersion in the task at hand is just another way of saying being focused on what you're doing without being focused on something else. Neurologically, this is really important to us because being present is a high dopaminergic experience for us, which means we can be nervous, we can be uncomfortable, and it still feels good for us, and it's a rewarding experience. So if you think about all the best rounds of golf that anyone on here has ever played, very likely there were times when you were nervous, but because you were focused on what you were doing when you were doing it, you weren't multitasking in a way that created self-imposed disruption. So as much as we think about being present as it is the gateway to high performance, what it actually is, it's the gateway to where is your worst performance. So essentially, where is my level of self-imposed disruption to my own performance involves me. Do I have access? Are my watches synced, essentially? And high performers sync their watches a lot, which means they're not eliminating themselves. They're not beating themselves. And so they're not just open to thriving, they have more access to their ability because their ability is actually playing out in the time frame that it's actually happening. There's also a variety of research that shows the more present we are in our lives, just period, end of sentence, the happier, healthier, and higher functioning we become. It just feels better to be present more often. If you think about most of the things that cause frustration and anxiety in our life, there are certain things. There's no human being that doesn't feel frustration or anxiety. But oftentimes it's us being stuck on things that have either already happened and now we either can't do anything about, or what we can do about it starts now, or we're worried about something that hasn't happened yet and we're playing out a bunch of what if or worst case scenarios, right? And so if we're just talking about the present moment, like it's as close as we can get to the optimal state of human functioning because it requires us to deal with the world as it is internally and externally. And we're not adding any self-imposed disruption. We're not distracting ourselves with anything else. And distraction does not feel as good as being present once we learn how to do it. And also when we perform better and experiences get better because we are present in them, it starts to become something that feels a whole lot better. And it's a far more reliable performance state than perhaps pairing your identity to outcomes that are either in the past or the future, or constantly being distracted during a performance. So that would be kind of the nuts and bolts. We're not looking for a state of no thinking. We're not looking for a Zen state. We're not even looking for something we're comfortable or certain in. We're just looking for present. And if you really talk about like what is the opposite of anxious, it's not relaxed. The opposite of anxious is grounded, meaning my watches are at the same time.
And I think a key point that you've made there, I think is so important to reinforce. This isn't this isn't resisting experience, is it? It's not the idea that you said you're not in this perfect Zen state. You're not trying to resist the thoughts and feelings and emotions that inevitably will come through. I think many people fall into the trap, and it's certainly reinforced on TV, and they say, oh, such and such a body's in such a great state. And you think, how the hell do they know? They've no idea what's going on in their experience. I think it's really,
Yeah.
really key to understand this isn't about resisting your experience. It's not trying to control thinking as such. It's being okay with feeling uncomfortable. It's being okay with some negativity that comes along from times, but you can then choose to bring your attention back to the task in front of you, the challenge that the golf course is presenting to you right in this moment. So I think, for me, from tonight's call, if people haven't heard me say this before, if you get nothing else out of this session, is that this understanding that it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to have some of these thoughts running through your mind, but you can keep coming back to that particular task, that challenge in front of you. What would your thoughts on that be, Raymond, and what you see with some of your clients, and perhaps the misunderstanding of this idea that we can actually control our experience and we can control our thoughts?
Yeah, we don't. I'll just say trying to control your thoughts with with more thoughts is about the worst strategy we can have
Yeah.
for it. Um, and we don't want to stop our thoughts. Trying to stop your thoughts would be like trying to stop your heart from beating. Like your heart is designed to beat blood and we need it to, and our brain is designed to think and we need it to,
Yeah.
right? One of the things that we know for sure from research is the more we try to suppress our thoughts, meaning I'm going to deny that this thought exists, or I'm going to smother this quote unquote negative thought with a positive thought, or I'm going to distract myself from some thoughts and feelings I don't like, creates a experience called suppression and amplification, where the more I try to stuff away my inner experience and deny it or banish it, the more elevated it becomes, as a thought experiment or an actual embodied experience. The next time you're really anxious, or somebody who's also anxious, just tell them that they should be relaxed and see how that impacts their experience. Like, very likely their anxiety and their frustration level is going to elevate, not alleviate, right? And so if we can learn to just allow for instead of resisting, so we might say accepting the fact that we're going to have some scratchy thoughts and feelings, that there is uncertainty and discomfort involved, even with our best performances. Again, they are part of the experience that we can navigate rather than something that is not supposed to be there. And then when they are, uh-oh, I must be in trouble. And then it also might be helpful for people to understand that our brain doesn't really have positive or negative thoughts. That's just a subjective valence that we throw on thoughts that we don't like. It only thinks in pursuit and avoidance. So when I'm going, uh-oh, don't hit it in the water, it's not thinking, oh, that's a negative thought. It's essentially registering to your brain as an avoidance-based task. Whereas when I say, ooh, there's a pin, I'm going to try to fire at it, or there's a target that I'm going for, or make a free swing, that is a pursuit-based task that my brain goes. So it's not that it's positive or negative, it's that it's avoidance or pursuit. And again, certain situations for us, avoidance is by far the better strategy. For example, if you're thinking about walking out in traffic and you're feeling some anxiety about it, be really helpful to have that avoidance-based pursuit for it. It's a good strategy for staying alive. But when we're on the golf course and we're trying to do something where the margin for error is about the size of a dime, and there's oftentimes grass or sand or whatever between the club face and the ball, having these avoidance-based tasks just creates more for our brain to try to be able to navigate rather than be focused on the thing it's got in front of it, which most of the time we are at least partially capable of handling, provided we are not making it harder on ourselves than it needs to be. And so one of the things that can help is understanding your thoughts are not positive or negative. They are just your brain going, avoid this, pursue this, avoid this, pursue this. And if we can start to see those avoidance-based tasks and the quote unquote negative thoughts as just thoughts, nothing more, not a precursor to the future, then you don't have to try to control your thoughts the whole time, which by the way is exhausting and super ineffective.
Raymond, as I say, I'm conscious of your time. I think that's been immensely valuable tonight, and we started off with one idea and one topic that we were going to talk about, and we've managed to kick the ball all over the field, I think, there, and cover some really fascinating ground. I know as I mentioned at the beginning, the book that you've got out, Golf Beneath the Surface, is a major contribution, I think, to this field. It's a real Fantastic piece of work. If you haven't already got a copy of that, I think it's if you're a coach or a player, it really is essential reading. We put a program together, Stable Confidence. Raymond, it sounds self-serving if I talk about it. Maybe you could summarize what we did in that program and what people might find valuable.
There's a little bit of what we talked about today in terms of, if you're looking at first of all, what is confidence? And then really talking about it can only be as stable as what you have constructed it upon. So if you think about your confidence like a house, the foundation of it, the pieces you've built it on are going to determine how fragile or how stable it is, and what it looks like to have more stable confidence and what it looks like to have less stable confidence. And then a couple of strategies for being able to stabilize confidence more if that's something that people are interested in. So that's the nuts and the bolts. It's going to be a couple of things that we have talked about tonight, certainly as part of that, like understanding the neurological underpinnings, but then hopefully get to something where people can start to put things into action a little bit more.
I do want to thank everybody for coming along tonight and supporting the session. It's great to see so many people here. We'll send out the recording the next few days on that, and also if you wanted to get hold of the Stable Confidence program, we'll give you the details on that. But certainly the Raymond's website, my website, themindfactor.com. If you've got any feedback or any questions, please get in touch. We'll maybe try and organize another one of these shortly. But thanks Raymond for your time. I know it's how valuable it is. It's been fantastic to see you, and thanks everybody for coming along, and hopefully you got something of value from it.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Karl, good to see you, my friend.
Thanks, Raymond. All the
right,
best.
Thank you. See ya.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, Karl, take care, my friend.
Thanks, Raymond. Be in touch.
All right, we'll see you.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Raymond.
be well.
Bye.